Good morning, good evening, and good day. Today, we're going to be topping into the next episode of How to Get Good at Steel Division 2, talking about how to position your units. And this is going to be a general walkthrough through different kinds of units, nothing in specific, just general ideas for how to position your different types of units well, and how to get the most out of them through the positioning on the terrain and on the map. If you enjoyed this content, please hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe for more Steel Division 2 content. Let's dive right in. So the first thing, and one of the biggest things to be concerned about when you are positioning your unit, is to be aware of their ranges. Okay, so if we look here, I have this 45mm AT gun. It only has a range of 1,250 meters. So when setting it up in this woods, instead of setting it up front here like this, in this position here, yeah, I can see down the road, but the fact is I can't shoot anything that far down the road anyway. So there's no reason to position my unit in a spot where it can get shot without shooting back. Like if I position that there, then this pack that he's setting up there will actually be able to, well, I actually might come up a little short, but depending on where he puts it, if he puts it up here, he will be able to shoot me without me shooting back at him. So instead of positioning him there, I'm actually positioning him kind of on the side of the forest here, and you can see with that red, use your C button to bring that line of sight in. You can see here that I can look about 1,250 meters down the road, and then he'll shoot things at 1,200 meters down the road. And this keeps my AT gun effective and safe, so it'll only shoot at stuff that is actually in range of shooting. This is huge when setting up support guns and stuff, that you make sure you're taking note of their lines of sight. And you can do that really well with forests and stuff, making sure that only their range is sticking out, because anything extra, basically, you're just inviting the opponent to shoot you. Now, if we look here, when setting up really close range units like flamethrowers, okay, so infantry units with really short ranges, it's really important that you position them when in towns and such in buildings that have limited line of sight, so that the opponent has to get close to them in order to engage them. So instead of setting up my flamethrowers in, say, this building here, which while it looks like it has great line of sight, remember the flamethrower only has a 100-meter range on its flamethrower, and that's the part you want to be shooting, right? So if I put it in this house, it now has a little bit over 120 meters of range that people could see him and start attacking before he could. This would be even worse, okay, because there's a lot of open area. Now this place, on the other hand, nice and short, right on the edge of that 120-meter range, so when things drive in, this would be even better, because then really just things would be right next to it. So anywhere in this really like tight circle, 120 meters is actually a little too far. It's technically outside of the 100. This would be an even better spot because they have to drive right next to it for him to actually shoot. So these are things to consider when placing your flamers and really close range infantry. You don't want them at the edge of towns and stuff where they can get shot at from a distance. Most of the time, positioning has to do with keeping your guys from getting shot unnecessarily from distances that they can't actually re-engage the opponent. Next, we're going to look at positioning armor, which can be a little bit more complicated actually than positioning infantry and such. The reason being that armor can't easily hide in forests and stuff, and you can't keep it safe by hiding it in woods. So when positioning tanks, you want to try to put them in places where they have nice long lines of sight. This is actually a little long because of course it has 1,500 meter range, but the truth is the most likely point that the opponent's going to come from is the road, right? So in terms of the road, it can see all the way down 1,250 meters about, and it won't see any further than that, right? Because it's really not likely that they're going to be coming down off that hill over there, right? So we're playing a little bit into the probabilities of where the opponent will come from, but it's unlikely they'll come down this way. That's kind of weird. So this is a pretty safe spot. And also you get this option then to back up and immediately cut off that line of sight if things are not going your way. So doing that with your tanks, putting them in positions where they have good lines of sight, but then can back out of that line of sight very easily, makes them much harder to kill. It gives them a lot more survivability. Another example here, where I'm again covering off this road with the tank, but I can very easily back off and get out of the line of sight if necessary if I run into something heavier than me. So these are things to consider when placing your tanks. You want them to have good lines of sight so they can actually be useful, but on the flip side, you don't really want them yeah, this is a great line of sight, but there's no protection for it. If anything catches it out here in this plains, it's going to die immediately. And I see this happening a lot with newer players, is they'll plop tanks out in open areas and just think they're going to do great things. They can't. It's too open. It's too easy for the opponent to counter them. You need to try to find light forest. You need to try to find cover in buildings, or green forest too. You can hide them here, push forward into this way. Edge of hills does well too. Another positioning thing is the edge of hills. All you got to do then is back up, and you can see this line of sight immediately going away. So if you want to be firing at stuff that's a little bit further away, you keep it further back. If you want to be covering that closer, but remember, you have further to back up then when that happens. One quick thing on positioning too, and this is huge. Hills cause really weird problems with your tanks. Okay, if you're on a hill and it's like facing downwards, or like, so you're on this hill and you're trying to shoot over here, if it is too steep, it literally just will not fire. So your tanks have this like limit to their gun angle. It's nothing, there's nowhere in the game that tells you this, and I'm not even convinced it's not a glitch yet still, because oftentimes if you look at the tank model itself, it looks fine, like it should be able to shoot, but it doesn't, and it'll just sit on the aiming circle. You have to be very careful about placing your tanks on hills. It causes a lot of issues and will make your tanks not shoot at some point. You're going to be sitting there like absolutely enraged and wondering, why didn't my tank shoot? Well, it's got these weird tank angles, especially when it's on the downhill. When it's on the uphill, it's not as bad. So like if it's like coming up this hill like that, it's really not going to be nearly as bad as when you're on the downhill and you're trying to shoot that way. You're going to run into these really weird tank angles that cause big problems. In terms of positioning your infantry in different types of forests here, notice that I'm not pushing my flamethrowers towards the edge of the forest, because then that allows enemy troops to fire at them from further than their flamethrower range. The whole point of these troops is to get in close to your opponents so that you can take advantage of their powerful close-range weaponry. So you do not want to set up flamers and SMG troops on the edge of woods, because you're just negating the whole purpose of them. Vice versa, placing these guys in the middle of this this yellow forest here is actually not the worst strategy, because then they can actually take advantage of their many machine guns. Like, this unit is really not as good when you take the 3 heavy machine guns away, light machine guns away. So you don't want to place them like here, right? Because then they can't take advantage of their longer range. And this is what we talked about in our infantry micro videos, in our how to use infantry, how not to suck with infantry, is not sending long range infantry into close range firefights. So these are not close range infantry, which is why he shouldn't send them in over me here, because they're going to lose. Even though they're way better troops, these flamethrowers will probably kill them. Now, when I move these Panzer Grenadiers in, I'm going to move them right to the edge of this forest here so that they can take advantage of their longer ranges. In terms of this positioning, this is really not a smart thing to do. He really should just place his infantry on the edge here so that he can take advantage of the green cover versus the yellow cover here. Whenever you can create a disparity in the cover, you want to, because that's going to give your guys a significant advantage and allow you to more consistently win combats. So here we can see a perfect example of what's going on with that whole angled hill thing. It even happens to your AT guns and stuff. So because this Pack 40 is on the edge of this hill, it has range to hit this grill, but it is not shooting. You can see it just sitting here in the aiming circle. It is because it is on this hill. We can see it is perfectly fine angled up like this. See, the model shows that it should be able to fire, but it doesn't. It just sits there and doesn't fire. So we can see here, for no reason, my grill is surviving. It should be dead. But because of this, he put this too steep of a hill, he is now not firing and therefore is losing the ability to kill this grill. So be aware, on very hilly maps, this is a very significant danger. We can see here this Ostrupen once again placed on the edge of this green forest in order to give me the cover advantage when I go into combat. This is a good placement here of this troop, because you get to fire back at the opponent. Although even a little further back would almost be better. That way the opponent has to come forward to see. If he stands here, both these green covers will see, and you're losing that advantage of that cover there. This is another example of tank placement in forest. You can see I have it placed in a spot that the line of sight is limited to about 1,250 meters of range. I could push it out a little bit further to get that 1,500 meters in, but he had recently been chasing after infantry, which is why he's not exactly in position. But right there is where you'd want to be. Right there. Any further, you're just presenting a target for opponents to fire at. You can see here's how you take advantage of green cover versus the yellow cover. This guy will very easily be able to stop all 3 of these units with their MG42s. Also, the double veteran C helps in this case as well. And we can see one single infantry unit can easily defeat multiple infantry units when you have that cover disparity. Next, we're going to talk about the positioning of flak and anti-air weapons. This is a bad placement for anti-air. Okay, now they're just walking through at the moment to this position, but the fact is it will only shoot at planes that fly essentially directly over it because of this extremely limited line of sight. Line of sight does matter for anti-air. So you can see it flying this close to it, and it still hasn't opened up fire. See, that is well within the range of this thing. And you can also tell that it lost line of sight when it flew down because of the fact this is on a hill and behind these trees. So you have to be aware when placing anti-air, it has to be in a position where it can actually get lines of sight on the planes. Okay, and now of course the lines of sight are different because it's looking up, but you can see now it flew underneath the line of sight of this Flak 37, so it lost the ability to continue firing. So you do have to be careful about placing AA on hills that have things in the way of it, okay? Because that will block your ability to shoot at the planes. Here we see the placement of this Flak 88 to allow it to fire as far as possible. So instead of putting it down here at the bottom of this hill, this would block its line of sight pretty significantly. I put it a little bit further back in order to facilitate the ability to fire further. Now, it is, again, about 500 meters further away from shooting something, but this does allow it to have open line of sight and more consistently fire at planes coming down this airway here. Coming back to placement of tanks, especially in the woods, you never want to place a tank right next to green woods. There's absolutely no reason for it. You're just asking for it to die. You want to have at least 120 meters of range between you and the edge of the forest. More is much preferable, of course. And you basically you want this circle to be right. You don't want it to be crimpled in at all. So if you see here when I get closer, it like stops. That just means now you won't be able to see stuff, and they'll be able to shoot them first. If you want to set them up, you want to be basically right here where you make this nice green perfect circle. That at least gives you a chance of shooting them before they fire at you. Now, most of the time, this is not a position you want your tanks to be in, but since I knew what kind of anti-tank stuff they had in here, they were hand grenades. Hand grenades have a 100-meter throwing range, so you do get that 20 meters to a little bit more than that, actually, about 150 meters of sight here. So you have about 50 meters to react. So when these guys start coming, I have about 50 meters of time to react and also get a chance to suppress depending on the kind of tank you have. Shermans can certainly suppress enemy tanks, enemy infantry within that amount of time. So that's definitely something to be considerate of when in those light forests with your armor. Next thing we're going to talk about is leader placement along with commander placement. So you never want your leaders naturally to be in the front. Okay, I see this also happen a lot. You never want to have these guys in the front of your lines. It's just, that's not where they belong. Their concept is to buff your other troops with their veterancy, not necessarily to fight on the front lines. Now, some leaders come with Panzerschrecks or snipers or other very useful weapons, and in those cases, yes, you have to make use of those troops in order to counter what needs to be countered, but you should not consider these guys frontline troops. The whole concept of these is to sit a little further back, provide both radio when available, and most importantly, veterancy to your troops. So providing that veterancy is way more important than providing the little bit of fire that they often provide. So make sure these guys are always solidly behind the infantry or the other units that you're using them with, preferably in some sort of heavy green cover that also gives them some sort of escape route. Okay, you don't get a ton of leaders depending on how you build your deck, but usually you don't have more than, say, 10 at most, and you need those 10 to cover as much of the battlefield as possible to give you that advantage. Also, another thing in terms of positioning your leaders, put on return fire so they won't shoot at enemy troops and reveal themselves without your hearsay. You don't want them to do that. So make sure that you throw on return fire when you're in these sort of positions when you really don't want them to be fighting. When you're in a hotter fighting area that you know the enemy's going to see them anyway, you might as well just put it on. But especially in towns when they're in buildings, return fire can be really, really useful. Next, we're going to talk about the placement of the commander. Naturally, you never want them out in the middle of everything like this. This is never good. You want them in some sort of heavy cover building or forest area with plenty of area to escape. You also don't want them standing right next to high value targets. So this commander is going to move right about to here, and you don't want to put him like right here. Why? Because when RD and stuff comes down to kill this flak, he will be standing there and he'll die, and that's not what you want. Now remember, they have about a 1500 meter range connection thing. So you need these, you want the leaders, when commanders are connected to the leaders give 2 veterancy bonus instead of just 1. So obviously you want them in range of this commandant as much as possible, right? So you have to consider that 1500 meter range when talking about the connection between the leaders and the commander. Remember, other leaders connect to more leaders. So this leader could technically connect to a leader over here. It creates a command chain, as they often call it, of leaders that can continue to get the 2-point buff, the 2 veterancy buff. Now, in terms of your commander, to make the most use of them, put some AA around them. Put an artillery somewhere in their vicinity. I'm not saying put nothing around the commandant, but you want to try to, you don't want to put things right next to it. You want to put it in a place so that they can give this like triple vet to this AA, making it way more effective to use. So make sure you're making double use. You're basically making double use of the commandant. Then you're giving some support weapons more veterancy, and you're also giving those frontline troops extra veterancy because of the commandant's effect. So just make sure that you're putting useful things around it. Say an AA gun of any sort will become way more effective because of that triple veterancy. We can see here how much faster that became suppressed and actually got shot down, most likely due to that triple veterancy on those flak 43s. Finally, we're going to talk about positioning of your artillery, and specifically your heavy artillery. So when positioning your artillery, the most basic rule of thumb is do not leave them on the road. Okay, this is the one thing I want you to make sure you don't do with your artillery. Do not drive it up here and unpack it right here on the road. Why? Because then when your artillery gets counter batteried, it's going to put your other troops at risk. So as other troops drive by, they can get caught by stray artillery shells that were meant for your artillery, and then all of a sudden your guys are being unloaded or they're straight up dying, and the opponent's basically getting free points. They're basically getting free targeting on your troops. So you want to make sure that when you are placing your artillery, you want to get them off the road a good ways. Yeah, I mean, this guy's probably still a little too close. I would say the further the better. So if you can get them a solid, probably out in the middle of here, because remember that the artillery coming in's got a pretty wide area of fire. So even this guy might be a little close, probably another 100 meters this way might have been more prudent to protect that guy. But you just want to make sure that you're not dropping them off right at your spawn points and stuff. That's how you get them killed. And you also don't want your artillery to be right next to each other. Notice I have one over here and one over here. That really spreads it out and makes sure, like, you don't want them like in a row, like 1, 2, 3, 4, like artillery batteries in the actual war often were set up. It looks cool. But what it's going to do is get you a lot of dead artillery really fast, because then stray bullets from all of them will be hitting your guys. Placing artillery in woods and stuff doesn't make much of a difference. You can put them in cover, but I don't believe it does a whole lot, because when the things that are counter battering them are going to do tons of damage to them either way. So really, you just have to make sure they're spread out and not on roads in order to not allow your opponent to get free kills out of their artillery. If you enjoyed this content, please hit that like button, subscribe for more Steel Division 2 content, and have a fantastic day.